Donald Trump has rewritten every rule in the book. All the things we used to think were limits or restrictions on a president, it turns out were voluntary, and he's not volunteering to abide by them. I think one of the most concerning changes we've seen in the last 4 years is the idea that a president should be influencing the Justice Department in who prosecutes and who it doesn't prosecute, how it handles cases involving the president's own friends and how it doesn't. We've seen in this case a Justice Department that has, under pressure from President Trump, let up on his friends like Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. You see the president repeatedly badgering his own attorney general to prosecute Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, all sorts of other people. And so I think that the politicization of everything, is a hard thing to put back in the bottle.
The norms that were in place, Peter, were surprisingly fragile.
Yes, you're exactly right. The norms were fragile. The things that were put in place after Watergate that we thought constrained the president and put limits and enforced accountability and transparency turn out to be easily warped if you find a president who's willing to do that. And it's a lesson, right? That in fact the system does depend on the willingness of the actors in it to play by the rules. And if they don't want to, if they don't think the rules are right, if they decide the rules don't apply to them, they can get away with an awful lot. To people who like President Trump, they see what he does as combating the system, the elites, the deep state. They believe that he is the truth teller and the champion of the aggrieved in America, and that the intelligence agencies and the law enforcement and the Justice Department and all these people are all part of a broader, conspiracy to protect their own power and their own interests and their own entitlements, and that he's the one guy who's really taking them on.
How big a role, Peter, has the media played in exacerbating and deepening the divide in this country?
When you and I were younger, there were 3 networks and CNN was just starting. There were a handful of big newspapers and the news magazines, and there was a collective understanding of what the facts were before we began to have an argument about what they meant, right? So today, everybody lives in their own fact universe, and you're not forced to actually even confront uncomfortable facts or facts that don't agree with your interpretation of the world. And I think the media is a big part of that. It should be our job to tell truth with power, but it also is not our job to be the opposition. And that's been hard in these last 4 years. I think a lot of our readers and viewers would like some parts of the media anyway to be the opposition. That's not our job, but it is our job to hold, the president accountable and to point out the things he does and to fact check him, truth squad him, and all those things. Every president I've covered didn't like their coverage. I've never met a president yet who said, hey, good job, you're really covering me well. They just don't do that, right? And I've been yelled at by the best, Republicans, Democrats, everybody. This is different, right? To have a president get up there and say, enemies of the people, fake news, that's good. And it does, of course, impact us. He succeeded at eroding our credibility. Now, we've also done that. We bear our own responsibility in some ways for our own credibility issues at times, no question about it. But enemies of the people means that there's not even a legitimacy to the press. Enemies of the people is a Stalinist phrase that was used to justify sending millions of people to the Gulag in the Soviet Union. That's a perniciousness that's different than the normal adversarial relationship that we have with the White House that normally I think is actually kind of helpful.
A lot of my followers are asking why the mainstream media is not covering the Hunter Biden story more. And I think journalists don't want to make the same mistakes they did in 2016 with Hillary Clinton's emails, but could they be overcompensating for that now?
I think there are some legitimate aspects to the story. If you go and look at it, it does seem clear that Hunter Biden traded on his father's name in business dealings. Now, has he done all the things that President Trump has accused him of? No, there doesn't seem to be evidence for a lot of the things that Trump just sort of throws out there. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence that we've seen so far, that I'm aware of anyway, that Vice President Biden used his position of power to benefit his son in some ways. I think the media is suspicious when a laptop suddenly shows up less than 2 weeks before the election on a story that's been covered now for more than a year, delivered by Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, who's currently been charged with fraud. The New York Post reporter, one of the reporters on the story, didn't want the name on the story. Fox News, we're told, according to our reporting, passed on the story at first because they were concerned. The Wall Street Journal news reporters have interpreted very significantly different than the Wall Street Journal op-ed side. And that's really telling, I think. So I think people are concerned about the story and not quite sure the best way to handle it, trying to look at it, independently and not with all of the partisan chatter in our background.
Can Donald Trump do anything to change the trajectory of what we're seeing right now?
This race has remained remarkably static, all things considered. If you go back to July of 2019 and you look at the polls, you'll see that Joe Biden had about a 9 or 10 point lead even back then. And here we are now a week out. And what is Joe Biden's lead? About 9 or 10 points on the national level. I mean, for all the things that have happened, coronavirus and George Floyd and economic upheaval and Hunter Biden's laptop and debates and all of these things that have happened, and we're right back to where we started in this race. Now, can Trump do anything next week? You don't want to ever discount him. He is a remarkable figure who has a remarkable capacity to surprise us, but I don't see what the obvious things that are available to him at this point in the next week to change the storyline.
Some of my friends and followers keep saying, we believed the polls last time, they were wrong. Why should they be believed this time?
People should always be skeptical of things like that because, first of all, a poll is a snapshot. It's of where things are today, not where things are going to be in a week. People, I think, made a mistake last time of interpreting poll results and then giving percentage odds of predictions, which is where I think we go wrong. I don't think we should be saying there's a 75% chance or 85% chance that something is going to happen in the future. That's not a journalist's job. Our job is not to predict the future. Our job is to tell you what's happening now and what could happen in the future.
When do you think we'll know the results? I know your job isn't to predict the future,
Right.
but I'm just curious, with everything you've looked at and people you've talked to, Peter, are you getting any kind of insight into how long it will take before the answer is known?
Well, look, obviously we've all said this and we should say this. It could take days, it could take weeks. Don't get worried if it does. That doesn't necessarily mean anything wrong is happening. It just means everybody's trying to count everything. Some of these states won't be counting mail-in voting for days afterwards, so the complete counts will take a while. I will say this, though. If you see a Biden victory in a handful of states like Pennsylvania, Florida, or Arizona on election night, that's probably indicative of where it's going to go for a couple of reasons. Those three states, if he wins any of those three states, he is likely, therefore, to get enough of the Electoral College to win overall.
Any of them?
Any of those three are really critical. If you assume he's going to get Wisconsin and Michigan, which seems likely, Wisconsin, Michigan plus Arizona is enough to win. Wisconsin, Michigan plus Pennsylvania obviously is enough to win. Now, if Trump is winning those three states on election night, it doesn't necessarily mean it's over because we haven't counted those mail-in votes, and those mail-in votes are thought to be favoring Biden at this point. So it really just depends on where things stand on election night at 11 o'clock.
You've gotten to know the president pretty well. Do you think if in fact he is not reelected, he will leave willingly, if begrudgingly?
I mean, look, he won't be happy, obviously, and he will make that clear to everyone far and wide. I guess anything can happen. I don't literally imagine that they're going to have to send people to remove him from the White House. I think he will avail himself of every possible challenge if he thinks there's some possibility there. I mean, in other words, if it is close in a few of these states, he will press, I think, the argument in court through recounts, whatever means are necessary for him, as long as he possibly can. And you know, it could be like Florida 2000, but on steroids. Now, ironically, we've already been in court now for months. There's really been 150 some lawsuits filed by both sides against different state rules on this and that. And the one advantage of all that litigation is a lot of these things may be worked out by the time we get to election day. So that, you know, in Florida, all these things were kind of a surprise and we were litigating them after the fact. Hopefully we've gotten some of these set by the time we sit down on November 3rd. We'll see.
Given the really tragic economic numbers, job loss, businesses closed, people getting evicted, unable to pay their rent, et cetera, why do you think the president still does very well on who could best manage the economy?
I think it's because people feel like things were really good before the COVID and they don't necessarily blame him for the economic effects of what's happened since March. They may blame him for not treating the virus seriously enough and for you know, not doing more earlier on that. But I think on the economic stuff, they think, well, he had a pretty good record.
Peter, you don't vote.
I don't, no.
Why?
Well, I started covering the White House in 1996. And with the exception of a 4-year stint abroad, I've been doing it ever since. And I always figured that I have to cover whoever wins. And I don't want to have made up my own mind, even in the privacy of the voting booth, about who that should be, because then I might have even a smallest bit of a rooting interest in proving that I was right, that that person should have been the person who was elected or shouldn't have been the person who was elected. And I just always found it easier to be more detached if I just, even in my own mind, even the privacy of the voting booth, don't make up my mind and decide this person is right or wrong.
Let's talk about the future of the Republican Party. And I think a great way to do that is through the tome you and your wife, Susan Glasser, who's a New Yorker writer, wrote, which took 7 years.
7 years, yeah.
The Man Who Ran Washington. It's a biography of James Baker. And what does he think about the current state of the Republican Party?
One of the reasons we really wanted to write this book was it's a story not just about him, but about Washington and how much has changed. And we actually started this back in 2013 in the dim recesses of the Obama era, when Washington was already pretty dysfunctional. And we thought that his story told us a lot about how things used to be and how things are today. And it's only gotten more so, of course, in the last 4 years. And I think Baker looks around and sees a Republican Party that's really moved away from him. And I think that Baker looks at Trump and pulls his hair out thinking about what's come of his party. With us in conversations for the book, he used words like crazy, words like nuts. I mean, he doesn't really understand this president. And so I think that his story in some ways helps us understand today. He was a fierce knife fighter in elections. Just ask Michael Dukakis or Al Gore, right?
Yeah.
But when it was over, he would sit down with the Democrats and they'd work out stuff to get stuff done. It wasn't all just about winning elections. And I think that's where things have changed today. The incentive used to be in Washington that if you were a member of Congress and you wanted to pass something, you would go find somebody from the other party, get them to sign on to your bill, and you'd get together at the House press gallery and say, see, we have a bipartisan bill. And there would be a reward for that. Today, it would be if you have somebody from the other party on your bill, it must be because you sold out. The word compromise is just a dirty word today. And so what I don't see is how we get past that at the moment. I think we will, I just don't know how that happens.
Having said all the things you've said about Jim Baker, he ultimately is a party first guy.
Yeah.
He is going to hold his nose and vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's fascinating. And a lot of his own friends are curious and don't understand why. And when we asked him about this, we talked about this for like 5 years with him. We kind of watched him wrestle with it. And I came to believe that it really is a parable for the modern Republican establishment. They don't like Trump. He's not their cup of tea, but they reconciled themselves to him for now.